The Tupperware lid clicks shut, the smell of cold steak a cruel reminder of my son's betrayal. Still, I don't move, just stare at the plastic container, the weight of being forgotten by the very family I raised heavy in my chest. As I turn, their laughter from the steakhouse cuts through my thoughts. My son and his wife, celebrating while I'm left with leftovers. While the silence thickens, I realize it. They thought I wouldn't notice. That's when I reach for the pen. My will is my final gift. A glass of silence, and they're erased. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Lucille's front door clicked open with a soft, familiar creak, the kind of sound that only comes from years of use. She wasn't expecting anyone, not today, of all days. Her heart stuttered when she saw Grant standing on her doorstep, holding out a container of what looked like cold fillet tips, the kind of dish you'd want to eat fresh, warm, and plated. But instead, there it was, wrapped in clear plastic, condensation already beating along the edges. "Sorry," Grant said, shifting his weight uncomfortably on the porch. "We did a last-minute dinner out. You know how it is." Lucille nodded without really hearing him, her eyes on the Tupperware in his hand. The faint smell of steak and garlic escaped in a slow exhale as he handed it over, and she took it from him like it was something fragile, not food but some kind of relic. She didn't reply. What could she say? The words were there, but they tangled in her chest, tight like a knot. Grant stood there for a moment too long, his hands awkwardly at his sides, as if waiting for some kind of invitation. Lucille's mouth was dry. She forced a smile, the edges of her lips trembling as she leaned against the doorframe, feeling the cold of the wood seep into her back. He didn't stay. After a few more seconds, he muttered something about needing to get back and shuffled off, leaving her alone with the Tupperware and a gnawing emptiness that had nothing to do with hunger. She closed the door softly behind him, and as the click echoed in the quiet house, she almost wished she could undo the whole moment. But the container sat heavy in her hands, its existence undeniable. She glanced at the clock, 7:45. It wasn't late, but it felt late, like the day had already moved on without her, leaving her stuck here in a gap, a hole. Minutes later, her phone buzzed. A new Instagram notification. Ivy's name flashed on the screen. Lucille tapped it without thinking, only to be met with an image of Ivy and Grant, wrapped in the glow of champagne flutes raised in a toast, Paloma Grill, the fancy place they'd always talked about but never actually went to. The caption read, "To building a legacy." Lucille felt something twist in her gut. She blinked, then read it again. The sharp edge of betrayal cut deeper than she expected, though she hadn't been expecting anything at all. The words felt too curated, too perfect. Everything about it, the polished smiles, the clinking glasses, was like a mirror to something she could never reach, something that she had been blind to until now. Building a legacy. She tried to laugh, but the sound caught in her throat. Without thinking, she shoved her phone into her pocket, pushed the Tupperware onto the kitchen counter, and grabbed a plate. She ate the leftovers without appetite, not savoring a single bite. No cake, no candle. The kind of birthday dinner that felt more like a cruel joke than a celebration. When she was done, Lucille scraped the plate clean and washed the Tupperware with mechanical precision. The warm water felt good on her hands, a small comfort in the cold room. She scrubbed the container as if she could cleanse it of whatever invisible weight it carried. It wasn't just the food inside, it was the message it had come with, the lie dressed up as a gift. Once it was clean, she dried it off and without thinking, carried it outside. She placed it carefully on the porch, the way you'd leave a broken thing back where it came from, as if to say, "This isn't mine anymore." She was turning back inside when she heard a soft knock at the door. Lucille froze, feeling the tension in her shoulders rise. She didn't move immediately, just stared at the door as if willing it to disappear. It knocked again, louder this time. Reluctantly, she opened it. Her neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, stood there with her eyebrows furrowed, her eyes flicking from Lucille to the empty porch. "Didn't you have plans with your family today?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, her voice like sandpaper. Lucille could feel her eyes searching her face, looking for something. Sympathy? Judgment? Either one would have felt the same in this moment. Lucille smiled, a thin, brittle thing that didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine. Just wanted some peace. Mrs. Abernathy seemed to buy it, or maybe she didn't. It didn't matter. After a moment, the older woman nodded and shuffled away, her footsteps echoing down the quiet street. Lucille stood in the doorway, the weight of the evening settling like a stone in her chest. She glanced down at the Tupperware on the porch, its empty silence louder than anything anyone could say. Then, as she stepped back inside, the sound of a car engine rumbled down the street. Distant at first, but growing louder, closer. Her pulse quickened. Lucille sat on the couch, her phone in her hand, staring at the Instagram story. Over and over, she rewound it, frame by frame. Each time, the image of Ivy and Grant's champagne toast reappeared. Radiant smiles, the gleam of crystal flutes clinking together in perfect harmony. But there was nothing for her in the frame, no sign that she had ever been part of their world. She tapped through the story again, and again, nothing. Not even a hint of recognition. The silence in the room pressed down on her, thick and suffocating. Her eyes moved to the portrait of Jack on the wall, his face frozen in that quiet calm he always carried. A photo, a memory. He was gone now. And in that moment, she felt it, something gnawing at her heart. They erased us, she whispered, her voice quiet and hollow. The words felt like something that should be spoken aloud, even if no one was there to hear them. Jack wasn't here to answer, not anymore. She turned away and wandered toward the small desk in the corner of the room, Jack's old journal still lying open there. She hadn't written in it for years, but now, the need to capture her thoughts felt unbearable. The words spilled out quickly, her pen scratching against the paper as she tried to make sense of the ache inside her. Today, I was a convenience. Tomorrow, I become the consequence. Lucille let the words sit there for a moment, staring at the ink that now felt like a confession. She wasn't a part of their future anymore. She was a shadow from the past. The realization sank deep in her chest. Needing to get out of the house, she grabbed her coat and headed to Café Miel, the place where she'd once spent hours with Sadie. The cafe smelled of coffee and sugar, familiar and comforting in a way she wasn't sure she wanted to feel. The barista behind the counter looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes. Lucille, hey, it's been a while. Lucille gave a tight smile. Yeah, I guess so. The barista was friendly, but her words felt hollow. We've missed you here. You and Jack used to come in all the time. The mention of Jack stung. He was gone, and now there was just this. Empty memories, fractured fragments of a life she once knew. Lucille ordered a coffee, then sat down at the corner table where Sadie used to sketch. She didn't stay long, feeling more out of place with every passing minute. Before she left, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. Sadie's name. I didn't know they didn't invite you. I'm sorry, Lucille paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to say something that would make this feeling go away, but there was no easy way out. Finally, she typed, "Don't be sorry, be different." The words felt final, a closing statement to everything that had happened. She sent the message, then pocketed her phone. When she stepped outside, the cold air hit her face, and she felt for the first time today like she could breathe again. But then the sound of an approaching engine broke the silence. A car, familiar, black, moving slowly down the street. Lucille's heart skipped. The same black car, the one she'd seen earlier. She froze, waiting. Lucille sat across from Daniel Mora, watching him as he scanned the will with quiet intensity. He was young, probably not much older than Sadie, but there was something in his posture, a measured stillness, a perceptiveness that suggested experience beyond his years. His dark eyes never left the document, and yet Lucille had the strange sensation that he was listening to her in ways that had nothing to do with the legal jargon in front of him. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a space where, for the first time in weeks, Lucille felt the weight of her thoughts settling into the right place. She didn't feel rushed, didn't feel like she had to explain herself, and that made her want to speak more than anything else in the world. Daniel closed the will with a soft click, his hands resting on the desk. "Grant inherits everything," he said, his voice steady, and Ivy has full control of the trust. The words felt like a slap, even though Lucille had known this. She nodded, her gaze drifting to the window where the autumn light was beginning to wane, casting shadows across the city. "And what if I want to leave silence behind instead?" Lucille asked quietly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Daniel's eyes flicked up to meet hers, a slow shift in his gaze as if considering her. "Then we start with a full revocation." He said it with a calm certainty, like he had expected the request, like it was something he'd heard before from others who wanted to sever the ties that had bound them to people who no longer understood them. She sat up straighter. "What do I need to do?" Daniel's fingers danced over the pages. Pulling out a fresh form, he seemed to already know the way this was going. "We'll draft a new will, and then you'll name new beneficiaries, ones who matter to you." Lucille's voice felt tight as she spoke, the decision crystallizing in her chest like cold, hard stone. "I want Sadie as the primary beneficiary. The full inheritance goes to her." Daniel's pen hovered over the document, his eyes narrowing slightly, calculating. "Sadie? She's your—" "My niece," Lucille cut in, her voice firm. "And I want her to have it all, everything. The trust, the house, the assets. Everything that was meant to be ours before they turned it into that." He nodded, but there was no judgment in his expression, only the cool professionalism that he had clearly mastered. "And anything specific you want to ensure with the trust?" Lucille didn't hesitate. "Redirect a portion of the funds to Arroyo Art Center. It's a place that always felt like home to me, even before everything." Her throat tightened at the mention of Jack, and she had to pause before continuing. "They've always supported the local artists, especially the ones who never make it to the spotlight. I want them to have what they need." Daniel scribbled quickly, making a note on the page. He looked back at her, the ink on the page a stark contrast to the stillness of her expression. "Anything else?" Lucille exhaled, a sharp, almost bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Yes, a no-contest clause." He raised an eyebrow. "A no-contest clause. I want it clear," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "If anyone challenges this will, they lose everything, all of it. No exceptions." Daniel met her eyes for a long moment, his brow furrowing just slightly as he processed her words. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I understand," he said finally. "It's comprehensive." "I want them to understand," Lucille replied, her voice steady now, the fury of 1,000 small betrayals pulsing beneath her calm exterior. "I want them to know that when I'm gone, they won't have a chance to undo what's been done." She sat back, her fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of the table. This wasn't just about money, it was about control, about making sure that the story of her life, the one they thought they could erase, was still being told on her terms. Daniel carefully set the papers down, his gaze lifting to hers. "I'll get the documents prepared, but if you're sure about this..." Lucille met his gaze, her hands shaking just slightly as the enormity of what she was doing began to settle on her like a heavy coat. "I'm sure," she said. A slight smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's lips, a look of understanding passing between them. "All right, we'll move forward with the revocation. I'll have the new will ready by the end of the week." Lucille nodded, the taste of finality on her tongue. As Daniel stood to leave, the weight of the decision she'd just made hung in the air like a thunderstorm, waiting to break. There was no going back now, no undoing the chains she'd just severed. But as Lucille walked out into the quiet hallway, the sound of her heels tapping against the polished floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, someone she hadn't expected. And in that moment, as the door swung shut behind her, she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The game was only just beginning. Lucille sat on the couch, the weight of the moment pressing down on her as Sadie played the video. It flickered on the screen, the voices of Ivy and Grant echoing through the quiet room. Ivy's voice floated through, casual, confident. "We'll have to freshen up the place one of these days. Make it modern." Grant's voice joined in, smooth and assured. "We'll make it modern. Open it up." Lucille's hand clenched, her chest tightening. They were talking about her home, her sanctuary. She had built it with Jack, piece by piece, and now it was becoming theirs. But they hadn't built it. They hadn't earned it. They wanted to open it up as if it was nothing more than a project, a space to manipulate. They want to open up what was never theirs, Lucille murmured, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the furniture. The place she had lived her life. The old Vigas beams above her head, once strong and full of life, now felt heavy with the weight of what was being taken. Sadie didn't say anything, but her eyes met Lucille's, full of understanding. Lucille ran a hand over her face, her fingers trembling slightly. They can't have it. They can't have any of it. Sadie nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I know. The next day, Lucille sat in Daniel's office, the stack of papers before her growing heavier with each passing second. She'd already signed the revocation, but now it was time for the final step, the new will. Daniel slid the stack over to her, each page a new chapter in her life that would be written without Grant or Ivy. She picked up the pen, her hand steady as she signed each page. It was final. No going back. You're sure? Daniel asked, his eyes meeting hers. I'm sure, Lucille replied, her voice quiet but resolute. She signed the final page, her breath shaky as the weight of the decision settled over her like a storm. Later that day, Lucille stood in the small gallery of the Arroyo Arts Center, feeling the familiar hum of creativity in the air. Araceli, the director, greeted her with a warm smile. I'm so glad you're here, Araceli said, her eyes gleaming with something Lucille couldn't place. I've been meaning to talk to you about something. Lucille followed her through the crowded gallery, where local artists displayed their work. Araceli stopped near a small corner, her voice dropping a little. We've been thinking, we'd love to have you join the board. Lucille blinked, surprised. She had never thought of herself as someone who belonged on a board, but in that moment, surrounded by art, the idea felt right. You've preserved more than memories, Araceli continued, her voice soft. You've given this place something lasting. Lucille stood there for a moment, the offer hanging in the air. She nodded slowly. I'll think about it. That evening, Sadie helped Lucille go through boxes of artwork that had been tucked away for years. Each piece, whether a painting or a sculpture, seemed to carry its own story, its own legacy. Lucille's heart swelled as she looked over the work, now feeling more a part of her than ever. It's time to share this, Lucille said, her voice thick with emotion. It's time for it to be seen. Sadie smiled, the warmth of her expression grounding Lucille as they continued their work. There was a finality in the air, something that felt like an ending, but also a beginning. The legacy that Lucille had fought so hard to preserve was no longer just a memory. It was a future. And in the stillness of the room, Lucille couldn't help but feel that someone was still watching, someone who had no idea that everything had just changed. The soft hum of the restaurant buzzed around Lucille as she sat at the table, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the white linen. The place was elegant, the kind of spot Ivy and Grant always seemed to choose, polished, almost too perfect. The kind of place Lucille had once imagined herself dining with Jack, before the distance grew between them and life became a long series of days spent waiting. Grant leaned back in his chair, a glass of wine in his hand, and grinned at Ivy. We're thinking about buying a second property, he said, his voice casual but self-assured, just in case Mom's place isn't ready for transfer yet. Lucille didn't flinch. She wasn't surprised by the words. She had known it was coming. They had been circling it for weeks, circling her as if she was something to be passed along, something to be tidied up and stored away. She could feel the edges of her own life being smoothed over, erased by their plans. It was happening in real time. Ivy's eyes glinted as she raised her glass, clearly pleased with herself. Just in case, she repeated, her tone syrupy sweet, as if to soften the truth. Lucille simply smiled, her lips thin, a controlled curve. She didn't say a word. Instead, she motioned for the waiter to refill her glass, then, without looking up, ordered the most expensive wine on the list, something she hadn't done in years. She let the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. If they were playing a game, she would play it on her terms now. Ivy raised an eyebrow as the wine was brought to the table, the glass gleaming in the candlelight. You're awfully quiet tonight, she said, her voice smooth, as if trying to coax something out of Lucille. A confession? A reaction? Lucille took a slow sip of wine, feeling the cool, smooth liquid slide down her throat. Just learning what's worth hearing, she replied, her voice calm but steady, as though the words themselves were a quiet barrier between her and the world Ivy and Grant had tried to pull her into. There was a flicker of surprise in Ivy's eyes, a brief, unspoken tension between them. Grant, sensing the shift, cleared his throat, his gaze moving over Lucille before returning to his plate. Ivy, on the other hand, looked at her with an unreadable expression, but Lucille didn't break her stare. The conversation drifted. Talk of investments, property values, what would come next, what would be left behind, but Lucille stopped listening. Instead, she let the hum of their voices become distant background noise, like a radio on too low to be meaningful. Finally, when the main course arrived, Lucille pushed her plate aside, the food untouched. The bite she had taken felt like ash in her mouth, empty, hollow. The conversation didn't feel real. The air didn't feel right. It all felt staged, as if they were trying to sell her a life she no longer wanted to buy. "I think I'll head out early," Lucille said, standing abruptly. She left behind the rest of her meal, untouched, and her half-full glass of wine. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need their approval. She excused herself, leaving Ivy and Grant in the dim light of the restaurant, watching her go. Back home, the house felt different, quieter than it ever had before. Lucille set the wineglass on the counter, taking a moment to breathe, feeling the weight of the day settle into her bones. She didn't want to drown in the noise anymore, not their noise. She needed silence. She needed to claim the space that had always been hers. With a soft click, she opened the door to the patio and stepped outside. The night was crisp. The sky spread wide with stars. She raised her glass to the sky, to the silence that was finally hers to keep. "To me," she whispered into the night, the words swallowed by the darkness. Inside, her journal lay open on the desk, waiting. Lucille picked up the pen with deliberate care, writing the words that had been sitting at the edges of her mind for so long. Silence is not passive, it's placement. She let the ink settle on the page, the simple truth that had eluded her for so long. Silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was where she chose to be, what she chose to hold on to, when everything else was slipping away. As she closed the journal, a soft click of the lock echoed through the room. The weight of the night felt heavier now, pressing against her chest, and as she turned to face the darkened house, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting for her to break. But she didn't, she wouldn't. Not anymore. The evening air was crisp, the weight of the silence in the room almost palpable. Lucille sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the clock on the wall filling the gaps. She had been reading, but the words blurred in front of her. Her mind still adrift after dinner. It had been a quiet night, the kind she had come to expect. But then the doorbell rang, breaking the stillness. Sadie's voice came before Lucille even reached the door. "Grandma," she called out, her tone tight. Lucille opened the door to find her granddaughter standing there, eyes wide, arms folded tightly across her chest. There was something unsettled about her posture, a tension in the air that wasn't there before. "What's wrong, baby?" Lucille asked, stepping aside to let her in. Sadie hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's Mom," she said softly, her voice almost cracking. She's saying I'm letting you drift, that I'm letting you fall away. She says I'm supposed to bring you back." Lucille's heart skipped. She wanted to reach out, to hold Sadie close, but she stayed still, absorbing the weight of her words. "Then let me drift, baby," Lucille said finally, her voice steady. "I've earned my direction. I'm done being where I'm not meant to be." The words felt like a quiet declaration, a final push against the forces that had tried to steer her for so long. Sadie looked at her with uncertainty, her eyes clouded with confusion and concern. "But I don't want you to drift alone," she whispered. "You're not alone," Lucille said, the words coming out softer now. "You're here, aren't you? You're with me." Sadie nodded, a small, sad smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I just don't want her to keep pressuring me. I don't want her to think it's my fault." Lucille felt her heart tighten. "You don't owe anyone anything," she said firmly, though a lingering ache tightened her chest. She reached over, squeezing Sadie's hand. "Not your mother, not anyone." The doorbell rang again, and this time, Lucille wasn't surprised. She knew who it was before the sound even echoed through the house. She rose, walking slowly to the door. It creaked open to reveal Ivy, standing on the doorstep with a plastic container in her hands. "I thought you could use a meal," Ivy said, her tone overly sweet, almost too concerned. Lucille took the container, her fingers brushing Ivy's for just a moment. She could feel the weight of the gesture, the unspoken claim, like an anchor being dropped into her life again. She set the container on the kitchen counter, her eyes narrowing slightly as she twisted off the lid. Inside, the smell hit her first, the raw, metallic scent of steak scraps, the bits left behind after the main course had been served. It was a half-hearted offering, a leftover remnant of a meal Lucille had never asked for. "This is what was left," Lucille said, her voice cold and tight. She didn't need to look at Ivy to know that the woman was watching, her expression veiled with a kind of false concern that Lucille could now see for what it was. The words tasted bitter, as sharp and uninviting as the scraps themselves. Without a second thought, Lucille picked up the container and walked straight to the garbage. She didn't hesitate. The scraps hit the trash with a dull thud, the container following them a moment later. "Not today," Lucille muttered under her breath. She turned back to Ivy, whose gaze had hardened but remained silent. Ivy didn't say anything, but her mouth tightened into a thin line before she simply nodded, her eyes briefly flickering over to Sadie before she turned and left, without a word. Sadie stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. Lucille turned back to her, a soft sigh escaping her lips as the door clicked shut behind Ivy. "Are you okay?" Sadie asked, her voice hesitant. "I'm fine," Lucille said, smiling faintly. "Just fine." Later that afternoon, Lucille sat at her kitchen table again, her fingers tracing the edges of a document Daniel had dropped off earlier, the final transfer papers for the house. She read through the details, though she already knew what they said. The house would soon be hers again, but this time it was for Sadie. It was a quiet victory, one that didn't feel quite as satisfying as she had hoped. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was no longer just a home, but a battleground. The transfer was happening. It was final. She placed her pen on the paper, feeling the weight of what she was about to sign. She wasn't just signing away the property. She was reclaiming her own future. It wasn't a concession. It was a choice. But as her fingers hovered over the dotted line, something in her chest tightened. She wasn't sure if it was relief or regret, but she knew one thing. It was too late to go back. With a deep breath, she signed. The ink dried on the page, and as she looked up, the silence of the house seemed to swell, filling the space around her like a quiet storm. Lucille sat at the kitchen table, the finality of the ink drying on the paper still fresh in her mind. The house was hers to give away, hers to place in Sadie's hands. But even as the relief from that decision settled, there was an undercurrent, a pulse of tension that wouldn't let her be. The phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence like a shot. It was a call from Daniel, and when Lucille picked up, she could hear the edge in his voice immediately. "I'm just going to say this once," Daniel began, his voice crisp, clipped. "Grant tried to contact me, again, demanding to know why he wasn't included in the estate." Lucille's stomach churned. "And?" "I shut it down," Daniel said, the sound of a keyboard tapping in the background. "He is not a client, nor a beneficiary. It's final. You don't have to worry about him trying to challenge anything legally. I've made sure of that." Lucille exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders finally ease. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter now. "I've got your back," Daniel added before hanging up. Lucille sat there, her fingers tracing the edges of the paperwork in front of her, as if confirming it once again. She was done with them, done with their plans, done with the quiet manipulations. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was her life, her choices, and they could no longer claim a place in it. Minutes later, the sound of tires on gravel made her step to the window. Grant's truck was parked at the end of the driveway, its engine still humming as he slammed the door and marched toward the house. Lucille's heart quickened, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid. He stood on the other side of the front gate, arms crossed, face red with anger. "Why are you doing this?" he shouted, his voice low but filled with venom. Lucille opened the door slowly, her expression calm, unyielding. "You fed me scraps," she said, her tone level. "I gave you the same in return. Grant's face twisted with frustration. This is ridiculous. You're not just cutting me out. You're cutting Sadie out, too. You can't possibly be this petty. Lucille raised an eyebrow. Petty, she repeated, her lips curving slightly. No, Grant. I'm punctual for once. She let the words hang in the air for a moment before stepping back inside, the door clicking shut behind her. She could hear his heavy footsteps pounding down the steps as he stormed off, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to see it. His anger wasn't hers to carry anymore. Later that afternoon, Lucille stood in the yard, the stillness of the land around her providing a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. The house was quiet, the breeze rustling the leaves of the trees, and Sadie was standing beside her, holding something small in her hands. "Grandma, I thought it was time we put something here," Sadie said softly, kneeling down in the grass. She gently placed a small plaque in the earth, the engraving clear and simple. Land of the living, not the inherited. Lucille swallowed against the lump in her throat, her eyes tracing the letters, the weight of them settling in her chest. It was perfect. It was her declaration. "Perfect," she murmured, a slow smile spreading across her face. Sadie stood and turned to her, her face soft, a reflection of the same quiet strength Lucille had worked so hard to find. "It feels right, doesn't it?" Sadie asked. Lucille nodded. "It does." That evening, as Lucille sat with a cup of tea, her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Ivy. The words, as always, were veiled, laced with passive aggression and hidden barbs. Some women grow bitter, some grow dangerous. Lucille's fingers hovered over the screen, her mind buzzing with what she could say in return. But then she stopped. There was nothing to respond to. Ivy's words were nothing more than echoes, empty attempts to force a reaction. Lucille set the phone down, her gaze steady. She didn't need to play into the game anymore. The silence around her felt different now. It wasn't oppressive. It was something she had chosen, something she controlled. And as the wind rustled the trees outside, Lucille knew that what came next wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. In the stillness of the night, she smiled, feeling the weight of her choices settle comfortably around her. The game was over, and she had won. Lucille stood in front of the safe, the cold metal surface reflecting the sharpness of her decision. The final papers, her disinheritance clause, the last of the legal documents that had severed the last ties, lay neatly folded in front of her. She hesitated for just a moment, then slid them inside, the satisfying click of the lock punctuating the moment. For a long time, the weight of this moment had felt like a heavy coat draped across her shoulders, pressing her down. But now, as the safe door clicked shut, the air around her felt lighter. The weight wasn't gone. It was placed in its proper place. She had done what she needed to do. With a deep breath, Lucille turned away from the safe, her fingers trailing across the countertop as she walked over to the table. From a drawer, she pulled out a single sheet, the disinheritance clause, the one that made everything official. She framed it carefully, the edges aligned precisely, before placing it by the window where the light from the late afternoon sun would hit it just so. The frame felt heavier than it should, but it wasn't just the paper inside. It was the finality of it, the unyielding certainty of her decision. She looked at the framed document and then out the window, where the garden bloomed in wild, unshaped chaos. The contrast struck her. The world could be like this too, wild, messy, and entirely hers to navigate. Daniel's voice rang in her ear a few minutes later, breaking the quiet contemplation. "It's ironclad, Lucille," he assured her, his voice steady through the phone. "No loopholes, no forgiveness clauses. It's done." Lucille nodded even though he couldn't see her. She was certain, she had known deep down that it had to be. There was no going back now. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice rich with the weight of what had been done. "You're welcome," Daniel replied, his voice softer now. "Just take care of yourself. Don't let them make you second guess." She didn't answer right away, but the words sank in. Don't let them make you second guess. That evening, Lucille walked into the Arroyo Arts Center, the soft hum of conversation rising around her. The place was alive in a way that felt real, and Lucille felt her heart settle into the rhythm of it. Araceli greeted her at the door with a warm hug, her eyes shining. "We're so glad you could join us tonight," Araceli said. guiding her toward a crowd gathered in the center. The celebration was small, intimate, but it was a celebration all the same. As Lucille took the microphone, she looked out over the room, local artists, patrons of the arts, friends who had supported her along the way, and she felt something warm stir inside her. A sense of belonging, of recognition that had been missing for so long. "What they thought was trash," Lucille began, her voice calm but firm, "we turned into treasure." She let her words hang in the air, letting them settle in the space around her. The room was still, the weight of her statement grounding them all. Lucille felt a flicker of pride. She hadn't just survived, she had created something. And it was more than just this building, more than just the art. It was her life, the one she had taken back for herself. Later that evening, she and Sadie found themselves painting together in the garden. The warm colors of dusk began to pour over the landscape, mingling with the strokes of paint on their canvases. They didn't speak much, but there was something profound in their silence, a quiet understanding that needed no explanation. Sadie's brush moved fluidly across her canvas, capturing the beauty of the flowers in a swirl of colors, while Lucille added delicate strokes to her own painting of the garden's edge. For the first time in a long while, Lucille felt like she had truly found her place in the world, not as a piece of someone else's puzzle, but as someone whole. Someone who had made their own mark. Then the doorbell rang again. Lucille's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this tonight, not this. She opened the door to find Ivy standing there, a letter in her hands. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of calm that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought you should have this," Ivy said. The letter held between them like a weapon. Lucille took it, her fingers brushing Ivy's once more, feeling that strange, familiar tension. As she unfolded the letter, the words jumped out at her, sharp and unmistakable. "This isn't how we do family." Lucille's jaw tightened as she read the words, but she didn't flinch. She didn't even let the words sting. "Good night, Ivy," Lucille said, her voice smooth, the calmness of the garden still settling in her chest. Ivy stood there for a moment, her eyes narrowing. But Lucille didn't move. The silence stretched for a beat longer before Ivy turned and walked away. Lucille shut the door behind her and stood there for a long moment, the letter still in her hands. She hadn't needed to read it. She had known what it would say, what Ivy would say. But Lucille didn't let it linger. She didn't let it settle in her chest. The game was over. And now she could finally breathe. Lucille sat at the kitchen table, the quiet of the evening pressing around her. Her fingers rested lightly on the small envelope in front of her. It was thin, inconspicuous, but Lucille knew exactly what it held inside. She opened it slowly, the words already etched in her mind. "Your portion, $87.34. Venmo preferred." She stared at the note, the absurdity of it sinking in. $87.34. A pittance. An afterthought. An insult dressed up as generosity. She didn't flinch. Instead, Lucille folded the paper neatly and tucked it into her will folder. On a fresh post-it, she wrote, "Exhibit A, what they valued." She glanced at the framed disinheritance clause by the window, its clean final lines a reminder of the path she had chosen. She had done what was needed, severed the ties that bound her to the hollow gestures of the people who had once claimed to care. Later that evening, Lucille sat in the dim light of her study, pen in hand, and wrote a final message to be read upon her death. It wasn't a grand statement, but it held everything she needed to say. "They dined. I decided." The words came easily, like the final strokes of a painting. Her decisions, her choices, laid bare for anyone who would listen. She knew it was enough. It was enough to leave behind, to set the record straight. The next day, Lucille called Daniel. His voice was steady, confident when he told her, "The trust is updated. A scholarship in your name for local girls in the arts. It's all set." Lucille felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of peace she hadn't expected. This was the legacy that would live on. Not the scraps, not the betrayals, the future she had shaped. "Thank you, Daniel," she said softly. That afternoon, Sadie sat with Lucille, sorting through old photographs, recipes, and recordings. The house had quieted, and Lucille couldn't help but notice the way Sadie's hands moved, carefully archiving what was hers to preserve. Together, they were creating something lasting, something that no one could take away. I'm just putting it all together, Sadie said, glancing up. The story of you, of us. Lucille smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. The things that matter will stay. Later, her phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Ivy. Lucille didn't need to read it. She already knew what it would say. Have you lost your mind? She didn't respond. Instead, she set the phone down and looked out the window, watching the last of the day's light fade. It was a simple thing, this silence. It was the truth, the one Ivy couldn't reach. Lucille had made her choices, and for the first time in years, she felt the freedom of it. She had nothing left to prove. The game was over, and she had won. Lucille stared at Ivy's text, the words still glowing on her phone screen. Have you lost your mind? It wasn't the first time Ivy had tried to provoke her. But this time, Lucille didn't feel the pull to reply. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard for a moment, almost as if it wanted to respond out of habit. But then Lucille put the phone down, deliberately turning it face down, the weight of the silence filling the space between them. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. Not to Ivy, not to anyone. So, Lucille left the text unanswered. Forever. Instead, she moved to the desk, where the camera sat on a tripod, ready to capture her message. The steady hum of the house felt like it was finally settling into a rhythm that was hers, not dictated by anyone else's expectations. With a deep breath, Lucille clicked the record button, her fingers brushing the cool glass of the camera lens as it began to roll. Sadie, she began, her voice calm and steady, the words coming with an ease that surprised her. Legacy is not a favor. It's a fingerprint. It's the mark we leave on the world, not because someone asked for it, but because we choose to shape it. Every day. She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. She hadn't known it before, not in the way she did now, but the act of shaping something, of leaving behind a piece of herself, had been her true inheritance all along. I'm leaving you something no one can take, the way we live, the things we create. That's yours now. She reached for the camera and stopped the recording, a sense of finality surrounding her as she sat back. It wasn't just a message. It was the start of something that couldn't be undone. A few days later, Lucille stood in the middle of the Arroyo Arts Center, the gallery full of familiar faces. The air hummed with quiet excitement, and Araceli caught her eye from across the room, her smile wide. Lucille, I have a surprise for you, Araceli said, her voice warm with excitement. We've been waiting for the right moment to tell you, but I think it's time. Lucille followed her to the back of the center, where a small group had gathered. The unveiling was simple, a sign, gleaming in the soft light, with a name she hadn't expected, the Lucille Room. Lucille stood still, a mixture of awe and disbelief settling over her. The words felt weighty, heavy with meaning. This wasn't just a space, it was a declaration. Tears welled in Sadie's eyes as she stepped beside Lucille, her voice thick with emotion. Mom, it's beautiful. Lucille wiped away a stray tear and hugged Sadie tightly. They may inherit noise, she whispered, but you inherit meaning. It was a simple statement, but it carried all the weight of the years of struggle and sacrifice, the years of feeling like nothing mattered. This mattered. This would last. Later that day, Lucille sat in her study, the final papers from Daniel spread out in front of her. The house transfer was complete, the trust officially amended, everything falling into place like the final piece of a puzzle. She signed the last of the documents with a steady hand, feeling a sense of quiet triumph settle over her. It was done. She had done what she needed to. Later that evening, Lucille sat down with a glass of wine in hand, glancing at her phone, the silence from Ivy's side of things oddly deafening. She didn't care anymore, not for the games or the messages. But Ivy, as expected, couldn't let go. She posted a photo of herself and Grant at Paloma Grill, the kind of image designed to evoke envy. Their smiles were wide, the caption simple but full of implication. To the future we're building. Lucille stared at the screen for a moment, the words burning through her. It was almost too perfect, too calculated. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she closed the phone, placing it face down on the table. For the first time in a long while, she felt no need to respond. The future wasn't theirs to build anymore. It was hers, and she had already built it. Sadie rushed up the path to Lucille's house, her feet light on the gravel. The sky overhead was a bright expanse of blue, the sun lingering just low enough to cast a golden glow over the garden. Everything was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There were no signs of distress, no hurried movements, just a stillness that felt at odds with the weight in Sadie's chest. As she reached the porch, she noticed the open window, the soft flow of the curtains as they swayed gently in the breeze, the kind of movement that made the house feel alive. It was all so serene. Sadie stepped inside and was immediately struck by the calmness. The faint sound of a piano played from the speakers, Lucille's favorite album, the one she used to hum to as a child. It was a quiet hum in the air, the kind that spoke of a life lived fully, softly, on her own terms. Sadie's gaze swept across the room. There, on the armchair by the window, Lucille sat peacefully. A book rested on her chest, the soft pages slightly open, as if she had been reading when her body had finally let go. A small, serene smile curved the corners of Lucille's lips, as though she had found the answer to a question she'd been asking for years. Sadie's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on Lucille's shoulder, but there was no response. The smile on her grandmother's face remained, but the stillness was undeniable. Lucille had passed quietly in her sleep. No chaos, no fear, just a simple peace, like the final note of a song played to completion. Sadie stood frozen for a moment, taking it all in, the weight of the loss beginning to settle on her. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but instead, she did what Lucille had always done in moments of quiet grief. She took a slow, steady breath and reached for the phone. A few minutes later, Daniel was on the other end of the line. "I'll start the process, Sadie. I'll handle the paperwork," he said, his voice gentle but firm. It was the kind of voice that could offer comfort and clarity in a world full of uncertainty. Sadie nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Thank you, Daniel." She disconnected the call and looked around at the house Lucille had built piece by piece. The house where Sadie had learned what it meant to live freely, without apology. It was still the same, and yet everything felt different now. That evening, the Arroyo Arts Center was alive with quiet reverence. The vigil had been organized quickly, as if the news had spread like wildfire, the community drawn to the center to honor Lucille in the only way they knew how, through stories, letters, and the soft flicker of candlelight. Sadie stood in the middle of the room, the quiet murmur of voices swirling around her. She could feel Lucille's presence in every corner of the building. It was a room full of gratitude, of love, of recognition for a woman who had shaped so many lives without asking for anything in return. One by one, people came forward to light candles, sharing their stories of Lucille's kindness, her stubbornness, her fierce independence. They spoke of her art, her wisdom, and the way she had given them permission to live their own truths. Sadie moved to the center of the room, her heart heavy but full. She had spent so many years feeling as though she was in Lucille's shadow, but tonight, as the room filled with light, she understood that Lucille had never cast one. She had only ever given. Then, just as Sadie was about to light a candle, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Ivy. "Why didn't anyone tell us?" Sadie paused, her heart briefly skipping a beat as she read the message. She had known it was coming, the shock, the anger, the blame, but she had prepared for this moment in a way Lucille never had to. She typed a response, her fingers steady, the words coming easily. She did. "You just weren't listening." Sadie hit send and placed the phone down, watching as the candle flame flickered. There was no more need for explanations. There was nothing to prove anymore. She stood tall, her heart full as the soft glow of the candles illuminated the room around her. Lucille was gone, but her legacy, the real legacy, was here, in this space, in this moment. And no one, not even Ivy, could take that away. Grant's letter was the first to arrive, a thin, crisp envelope that was immediately familiar. Sadie opened it, already knowing what it would say. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a few harshly written lines. "You celebrated each other while I washed your Tupperware. Consider this your receipt." Sadie's lips tightened as she read it. Grant had never understood. He had always been the one to complain about what he never got, the one left on the periphery. His resentment had always been loud, a noise that had never quite found its place. She folded the letter slowly, placed it aside. It was nothing new, just another echo of the past. Next came Ivy's. The words were no less familiar, but they still felt heavier somehow, as though they were laced with something more than disappointment. You used hospitality like wallpaper, only for guests, never for me. Sadie felt a sharp pang. She knew Ivy's kind of love, one that was only ever about taking, never giving. The house had always been warm, full of welcoming gestures, but Ivy had never truly seen what it meant to give. She had always taken what was offered without ever considering what it cost. Sadie set the letter down next to Grant's. This, too, was expected. Then came her own letter, the one Lucille had written for her. Sadie unfolded it carefully, the paper soft in her hands, the words written in Lucille's familiar script. You saw me when I vanished, so I left you everything worth seeing. Sadie paused, feeling the weight of those words pressed down on her chest. Lucille had never expected to be seen. She had simply been. But Sadie had always known, always understood the quiet depth of her grandmother's heart. And now, in those few lines, Lucille had given her the inheritance of meaning, not just the house, not just the art, but the lessons she had imparted without ever saying a word. Sadie smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. The next letter was from Araceli. Sadie had expected it, had felt it in the air during their many conversations about life and art. It was short but filled with that familiar warmth that had always come from Araceli's understanding. Keep making art from abandonment. That's how we survive. Sadie read it twice, letting the words wash over her. Lucille had always turned abandonment into something beautiful, and Araceli knew it, had always known it. Now it was Sadie's turn to carry that torch. Finally, there was Daniel's letter, one she hadn't expected, but one that seemed fitting all the same. The words were simple but profound. Thank you for giving me a name that will outlast a check. Sadie smiled faintly. Daniel had never been interested in the material things. His was a love that was rooted in something deeper, something more enduring. He hadn't just handled Lucille's finances. He had handled her heart, her legacy. Sadie read through the last line of each letter, a subtle weight pulling at her chest as she reached the bottom of the stack. There, in Lucille's final note, was the phrase that tied everything together. I did not go quietly. I simply went ahead. Sadie closed her eyes for a moment. Lucille hadn't left anything behind to be mourned. She had moved ahead, her legacy already set in motion. The path was clear, and now Sadie knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to let it all fade into the background. Lucille's legacy was meant to be seen, and Sadie was ready to make sure of it. The launch of Lucille's memoir at Café Miel was a quiet affair, but it drew a crowd that felt both familiar and new. A mix of artists, patrons, old friends, and strangers, many of whom had once sat alone at their own tables, waiting for someone to see them. The air was thick with anticipation, but there was also something else, something tender, the kind of atmosphere where the past is never truly gone, but still lingers in every corner, in every conversation. Sadie stood near the back, watching the room slowly fill with people. It was hard not to feel the weight of Lucille's absence, even in this space that had been so familiar to them both. She watched as the crowd gathered around the tables, murmuring softly as the books were handed out. The soft clink of coffee cups, the rustle of pages, it all felt like a symphony of things left unsaid. The memoir, Table for None, had chapters that held stories, not of triumphs, but of absence. The Tupperware years, the inheritance of absence, and Table for None. It was a collection of moments, small, quiet stories about what it meant to be overlooked, to be silent in a world that valued noise above all else. Lucille had written about the things most wouldn't want to face, the loss of self, the isolation, and how, in the end, those moments had become her greatest treasures. Sadie stood leaning against the bookshelf, watching as people flipped through the pages, some pausing on a chapter, others nodding in understanding. The proceeds from the book were going directly to the Lucille Ortega Fund for Forgotten Women Artists, a project Sadie had started in Lucille's honor. It wasn't just about the money. It was about lifting up voices, giving a platform to the women who had never been given one. The room, filled with the soft murmur of voices, began to settle into a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The kind of quiet solidarity Lucille had always sought, though it had taken the world this long to find it. But then came the message. Ivy's friend had posted a screenshot of the book cover online with a simple comment. "Wasn't this your mother-in-law?" Sadie's heart skipped a beat as she glanced at the post on her phone, the image of Lucille's memoir standing proud and strong on the screen. She didn't even have to check Ivy's account to know what would come next. It was the same behavior, the same silence, the same passive-aggressive distance. Sure enough, Ivy's response was swift. No comment. Sadie stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling the familiar sting of it. Ivy's refusal to engage wasn't new, but somehow this felt different, more like a denial than ever before. The truth that Ivy refused to acknowledge, the one she couldn't stomach, was now printed on every page. Grant, meanwhile, wasn't so silent. He tried to post a tribute on his social media, trying to turn Lucille's death into something about him. His words were carefully chosen, as if he could somehow rewrite his own role in the story. The comments were quick to follow. "You ghosted her. You weren't there when she needed you. Now you want to make it about you?" The words piled up, some cutting, some more restrained, but no less sharp. Grant's face, frozen in a photo from years ago, seemed to twist with frustration as he watched his post devolve into an avalanche of backlash. His attempt to claim Lucille's memory was met with the harshest kind of truth. The truth he had ignored for too long. As the comment section grew louder, Grant quickly deleted the post, but the damage had already been done. The crowd that had remained silent for years was no longer afraid to speak. Sadie, standing in the back of the cafe, could feel the weight of it all. Lucille's voice was now out there, and no one, not even Ivy, not even Grant, could silence it anymore. She stepped up to the front, ready to speak, ready to take her place in the light Lucille had made. The crowd, the artists, the strangers, they were all here because Lucille had given them something they hadn't even known they needed, the chance to finally be seen. And as Sadie opened her mouth, she couldn't help but think, Lucille may have been gone, but her presence had filled every corner of this room. She had always been here, and now they could no longer ignore her. The letter was simple, its tone clear, the words deliberate and uncompromising. As Sadie unfolded it, the message became as loud as any speech, louder than any words Ivy or Grant had ever spoken to her. The paper crackled slightly in her hands, the weight of it sinking deep into her chest. "To everyone who thought I wouldn't speak, here's your echo." Sadie read the letter aloud, her voice steady, the words punctuated by the soft murmur of the room behind her. The moment felt surreal, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The crowd at the dedication stood still, their attention drawn to the weight of the moment. Lucille's words, her final act of defiance, now filling the air like a song that had waited to be heard. It wasn't just the opening of the art center's newest exhibit. It was the opening of a new chapter. And Lucille had made sure her voice echoed through every corner of it. "To Lucille," Sadie continued, her voice clear, louder now, carrying through the silence of the room. To silence, to severance. The room followed suit, lifting their glasses in unison. The clink of glasses was sharp, ringing out as the final toast lingered in the air. The crowd raised their glasses in a quiet tribute, each person holding their drink as if it were a part of Lucille's legacy. Lucille had always known how to make an impact without saying a word. Now, in the space she'd created, the crowd was giving her what she had always deserved: attention, respect, acknowledgement. Sadie looked out over the room, the weight of what had just transpired settling in her chest. Grant and Ivy were not there. They had been intentionally excluded, and the emptiness of their absence was the loudest declaration of all. Weeks passed, and the space that Lucille had once filled was now a place for others to inhabit, for others to find their voice. But as expected, Ivy's resistance didn't cease. She filed an appeal to contest the estate, a final attempt to reclaim something she believed she was owed. The letter arrived in Sadie's inbox with a cold, familiar sting, her mother's attempts to rewrite the past. Sadie forwarded it to Daniel, who responded quickly with a reassuring finality. It's dismissed immediately. No merit. There would be no turning back now. The family's grip on Lucille's life and legacy had been severed. The silence that had once been imposed on Lucille was now a deliberate choice, and it was theirs to keep. At the final installation ceremony, Sadie walked up to the centerpiece of the exhibit, a glass sculpture. It was suspended midair, delicate and frozen in time. The glass, perfectly clear but filled with a weightless emptiness, symbolized the absence of what had been, the absence of the voices that had once drowned out her grandmother's. Sadie paused before it, her hand lightly resting on the pedestal. The sculpture was hers to install, the final piece of collection she had curated not just for Lucille, but for herself, for everything Lucille had taught her about standing in silence, about creating from the space left by others. She took a deep breath before speaking softly to the small crowd that had gathered around. This, she said, gesturing to the suspended glass, is the toast we never got to make. It is empty, suspended in time, because Lucille's place will always be unfilled. This space is where the noise of the world used to exist. Now it's silent. And that silence is hers. As she spoke, the weight of Lucille's absence didn't feel like a loss. It felt like the beginning of something new, something lasting. For the first time in years, Sadie understood what her grandmother had meant when she said, "I did not go quietly. I simply went ahead." Lucille's absence wasn't something to mourn, it was something to carry forward. And as the crowd admired the sculpture, the air heavy with the weight of what had been said, Sadie smiled. Lucille had gone ahead, and now it was time for the rest of them to do the same. The room fell silent as Daniel began reading the will, each word clear and unyielding. Sadie stood at the front, her eyes scanning the faces around her. She had already seen the document, already knew its contents, but hearing it read aloud, out in the open, felt different. Lucille's voice, even in death, was powerful. This was her final act of defiance, her last claim on a world that had ignored her for too long. As the first lines were read, Sadie felt the weight of them settle into her chest. Lucille had always been direct, never one to sugarcoat the truth. To Ivy and Grant, who thought I would give them something more, I leave nothing but this printed quote. This is what's left. The words hung in the air like a declaration, an ending to a chapter that had never been fully acknowledged. Ivy's lips tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Grant remained still, his posture stiff. Neither of them had been invited to speak, not by Lucille, and certainly not now. It was as it should be. Sadie felt a quiet satisfaction, but there was no gloating in her heart. There was only an overwhelming sense of peace. Lucille had taken back control, even in death. Ivy and Grant had wanted more, but they would never get it. They had been given nothing. The will continued, detailing Lucille's final wishes with precision. Sadie is to be the steward of the home, of the fund, and of the story. This is my gift to her, my trust in her to carry my legacy forward. Sadie's heart swelled with the weight of that statement. She wasn't just inheriting property or money, she was inheriting responsibility. The story was hers to tell, the silence hers to fill. It wasn't an easy task, but it was the one Lucille had chosen for her. And it was a responsibility Sadie would carry with honor. As if in recognition of the responsibility, Araceli stepped forward, her voice soft but full of purpose. In Lucille's honor, she began, looking directly at Sadie. We will rename our citywide program to Lucille's Table, a place for forgotten women artists, a space for their voices to finally be heard. The room erupted into applause, but Sadie stood still, absorbing the weight of it all. Lucille had wanted this, had given everything to create space for the unheard. Now it was real. Now it was happening. As the evening wore on, Sadie sat in the quiet of the room, the glass of wine in her hand untouched. She had already started her own tradition, a ritual Lucille had given her permission to make. Every year, on Lucille's birthday, Sadie would raise a glass of silence. No words, just the act of remembering. In the Lucille room, a framed line from Lucille's memoir hung. To those who toast themselves while serving others scraps, you are not remembered, just removed. Sadie stood before it, her heart full but steady. Lucille's absence was no longer a pain. It was a purpose. The game had ended, and Lucille had claimed the victory. Sadie took a slow breath. The final line of Lucille's life, her life now, played in her mind. They gave me leftovers in a Tupperware while they toasted each other at a steakhouse, so I toasted them out of my will with a glass of silence. And just like that, Lucille's voice filled the room, loud and clear. She had gone ahead, and Sadie was going to carry her forward.